Hey, welcome to part one of my message for this week. I'm very excited about the things that I'm going to be talking about and what we're going to get into today. In part one, I'm going to look at Haggai 2 verse 19, which we spent some time on last week. Now, if you guys remember from then, I'm going to now break into the 4 different kinds of fruit that it says that you will have in your garden. So this week I'm going to be looking at grapes and the grapes that say you will produce in your harvest. So I'm going to be looking at Haggai 2 verse 19, and then also I'm going to split off and look at Numbers 13, and then I'm also going to look at Isaiah 5 to provide a little bit more context for what I want to be talking about in part one. I hope you guys enjoy, and I'll see you guys back in part 2. Bye. Hey, welcome. If you guys are here watching this, I'm so thankful, and I really feel like I have a good message to share with you guys for this week. We're going to be looking at Haggai 2 verse 19. So if you guys have already pulled that up, that's great. I'm so excited. I'm going to read it. This is where we're going to start off, and then we're going to branch off from there, and we're going to look at specifically grapes, as I was talking about in the introduction. So Haggai 2 verse 19 says, "Is there yet any seed left in the barn? Until now." I love those words. Until now, because there are so many things that we have done before that can lead up to what we're doing now, and sometimes we find that we don't, have the production or the harvest that we want then, but that's until now. Until now, the vine and the fig tree, the pomegranate and the olive tree have not borne fruit. Now this is the important part. From this day on, I will bless you. This is God talking to them, because God says, I don't care what you've done in your past. I care about what you're doing now, and who you turn to in the past doesn't take away from the fact that you are turning to me now. So you might have done that until now, but from this day on, I will bless you. And that's so powerful. So this week we're going to be looking at grapes. So what do the grapes really represent? Do they have any specific meaning? And yes, if we turn to Numbers 13 verse 23, this is a single verse out of a story that talks about Moses sending spies into the chosen land, the holy land that God promised to the Israelites. And then verse 23 says this, says, "When they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs." So this is important, because not only did it look at the grapes, but it looked at 2 other fruits that we're going to be covering, which are the pomegranates and the figs. So we'll spend probably a little bit more time in this passage in the coming weeks. But Moses here sent spies into the Holy Land to see if the land was fertile, right? God promised milk and honey, a land flowing with milk and honey to the Israelite people. So they are expecting it to be fruitful. And so Moses says, go bring me some of the fruit that's there to see if the land is flowing with milk and honey. So these grapes that they got, they only needed, it said that they got a cluster of grapes, but the thing is they only needed 1 cluster of grapes, because in the valley of Eshcol, the grapes were so ripe and were so rich in the size, in the flavor. They were phenomenal. They were great to make wine out of. They were great to use as raisins and whatnot. So these grapes, they only needed a cluster. In fact, it says that just by cutting this one cluster, it took 2 men carrying the branch in order to carry it back. That's how big it was. This one cluster weighed so much that 2 men had to carry it on its branch back to Moses. This was very fertile land, and that's where God wants to take you in your life. God wants to take you to a land of milk and honey if you turn to Him and allow Him to control your life. God wants to bless you in this way. He wants to create in you these grapes. So this grape, right, one way that grapes are represented is that it has fertility, right? There's a special meaning of fertility with the milk and honey, the land of milk and honey, and the size of the grapes. You're very fertile if you have good grapes. So grapes are often seen spiritually, in a spiritual context, as the relationship between God and His chosen people, or God and the people of Israel, the Israelites. But God, when He chose these people, He expected them to produce good fruit. He expected good grapes out of them because He did plant the seed that the grapevine grew through, and we'll be looking at that a little bit later. And so He expected that since He planted, that as long as the Israelites stuck to the right grapevine, then they would produce good fruit. But He found, we're going to flip over to Isaiah 5, verses 1 and 2. And God is talking about here about the discrepancy between what He expected of Israel and what they actually produced. So Isaiah 5 verses 1 and 2 say this: I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one has a vineyard on a fertile hillside. And now watch what God does here. This was the author talking about God and thanking God for the vineyard that He's created. So now let's see what God has done for you already to make your endeavors as easy as they possibly can be. He dug it up and cleared it of stones. He planted it with the choicest vines, or the best vines that there were. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress as well. So God has prepared the land. And it doesn't always necessarily mean that you're going to have an easy journey, because that's definitely not the case. We talked about in one of my earlier messages called Standing Across from Your Blessing, or what I like to call it, Stretch It Out. We look there at how if God is a fire and He's fighting in front of you, then by you following behind, you're walking through the flames. It's not always an easy walk, but it's a fruitful walk. God wants to bless you with fruit, in the environment that He's created for you has allowed you to be as fruitful and successful as you possibly can because of what He's already done to prepare the land for you. When you think about the Holy Land, these people, the Israelites, they had to walk, and they traveled for 40 years in the wilderness, 40 years out in the desert, and they walked and walked and walked, and after coming out of 400 years of slavery, there was a lot of doubt, there was a lot of frustration, but when they finally got to where God told them that they would be, He made it fertile with just tons of fruit. The land was filled with milk and honey and riches, and God wants to deliver you to a point where you can be so fruitful and so overflowing that you're able to bless other people because you have so much of a surplus. And sometimes it takes you having to walk through the wilderness or to go through the desert, but God wants to get you to that point in your life. But look at what it says here at the conclusion of verse 2. It said, He looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. God was expecting good grapes, right? He had already dug up where the plants would be planted. He got rid of the stones. He built a watchtower. He made a wine press. He prepared everything for the Israelites. The land was theirs. There might have been people in it at the time, but God drove them out quickly and easily, and everything that was in their way, God took out of their way, and he prepared the Israelites to be fruitful. But God found that they continued to produce bad fruit. And repeatedly through the Old Testament, we see that the Israelites turned from God to false idols, to earthly things, and then that limits them from receiving the blessing of God and from producing good fruit. So even though God has prepared the land, doesn't mean that it's going to come out, because it matters about the people and what the people turn to and what you turn to in your life, so you can be in a place where God has called you and God has brought you to this position. And that's great, and I am so thankful that God has done this for you. But are you producing good fruit? Are you turning to God when it's necessary? And are you doing things to help you get to the next step? Instead of turning to things of this world, we should be turning to God, because God is the one who's already prepared and wants us to be fruitful. So who are you turning to in these times? It's an important question that we need to ask ourselves, because the fruit that we bear is an outcome of what we turn to. That's important.